And then we get to Malachowski method 2, and there's quite a lot of text here, but I think it's worth going through because he's trying to emulate a kind of a profit split, right? Mr. Malachowski considered the royalty rates from merger and acquisition transactions and value allocations. He explained the method as follows. And what he does basically, he says here, when you buy a group, you and the seller basically come to an agreement on where you think the future discount cash flow, which comes from future profits, will end up. And you may be a little higher or a little lower than the seller, and the seller may be the opposite, but you will meet in the middle, and that will be the purchase price. So it does give you an idea about future profitability, and then if you can split out that part that relates to IP, you can then go and work that back to a royalty rate, okay? And Malachowski says, I also consider the profit splits implied by the value allocated to brands assets in each of the transactions identified by Markables. And these were acquisition transactions, if I understand correctly. Markables estimate the percentage of enterprise profit allocated to the brand assets of the acquired business based on the purchase price allocation data. The profit split provides a proxy for the shares of profits that would be negotiated between the owner of an intellectual property, the assets, and the licensee, the licensor or the licensee. It is a consideration when assessing the reasonableness of a select royalty rate. The brand over the enterprise value ratio calculated by Markables provides insight into the range of enterprise profit that's allocable to the brand assets in each comparable transaction, because you get the purchase price allocation to the brand, you know what the enterprise value is, and that's how you can calculate this ratio. Markables describes the profit split as follows. Purchase price allocations provide meaningful data to perform profit split analysis. Values reported in purchase price allocation represent the present value of future profits they are expected to generate. Like I just said, the whole negotiation process between the buyer and the seller of a group. The ratio of a specific intangible to enterprise value is a profit split which this intangible is expected to contribute to the total profits. And again, remember, in your purchase price allocation, you need to allocate which part of the purchase price did relate to the intangibles, right? So you have that number, and you definitely have the enterprise value because you assume, I think, under the Markables method, that is the purchase price. Method 2 is a dataset that is 100% based on the purchase price allocation from publicly available information. Markables happens to be an aggregator of that, but it is not their data. And what Malachowski says here is, okay, so I'm using Markables data again, but unlike method 1b, here Markables just gives us the data that they collected themselves. They don't manipulate it in any form or way, right? It is important to recognize that the majority of transactions included in Markables data were companies with brands that possess less brand strength, scale, and recognition than the relevant items for PepsiCo and Gatorade. And he comes back to this in a moment. Mr. Malachowski provided the following summary of the outcome. So if you divide the brand by enterprise value, your minimum was 6.5%, your maximum 81.5%, and your it doesn't talk about the lower quartile, but quartile 3 was 50%, and quartile, the median was 38%, right? So at least, hopefully, the lower quartile was also about 12 points away from the median. So then you had a bandwidth of 50%. Mr. Malachowski stated that he did not have Schweppes EBIT margin on the EBA, so he had the same problem as Mrs. Wright, and what he ends up doing is he used the same numbers as Mrs. Wright did because that seemed reasonable to him. He then took the following steps. The acquirer of a business has to allocate the acquisition purchase price to the acquired assets, and so I used the Markable data to identify the comparables and the brand and EV ratios. As we already said, this is what you need to do. You need to allocate the purchase price to the intangibles, and then you have the EV ratio and you can go calculate. I began with analysis of profitability of the bottler. I relied upon SI Holdings calculated historical EBIT of 9.6%. Thus, the 9.6% includes the implied cost of the royalty for the use of the brand asset. So I added back the assumed royalty payments to EBIT to arrive at a gross up EBIT for this analysis. So what he says here is we know what the size EBIT is. That was 9.6%, but that EBIT already includes payments for royalties or deemed payments for royalties. So we need to gross those up so we can get these pre-royalty payment EBIT, and then we can go and calculate a realistic royalty rate once we've taken out the one that was in there in Asahi's numbers already. And considering the brand strength of the relevant items as compared to the strength of the comparables, this is Mr. Malachowski, relied upon the third quartile of the Markables transactions in my determination of the gross up EBIT and implied royalty for Pepsi, Gatorade, and Mountain Dew brands. The third quartile is 50.7%, as you can see in the table to the left, which implies the royalty EBIT of 9.6%, which represents 49.3% of the enterprise profit before the implied royalty payments for the brand. So if you take the 9.6% and I don't know what other number you then use, you end up with a pre-royalty EBIT of 19.5%. So you must be adding another 10 or 9.9% Am I right? Or 10.9%, 9.9% to get to the EBIT of 19.5%. Applying the upper quartile brand EV ratio resulted in a profit split of 9.9%. Is what Malachowski says. And then Mr. Malachowski accepted that to the extent his method relies on the value assigned to the trademarks, it relies on the assumptions made by the appraiser of the purchase price allocation. Because remember, Markables still got their data from appraisers of the value of these groups, right? So one would need to go into the Markables database itself to find out exactly how they calculate this. Mr. Malachowski was asked why he chose the third quartile. He said he believes there's a correlation between strong brand and higher brand to EV ratio. And since you remember, he already said on the left side that he believed that the PepsiCo brands were much stronger than those in the Markables database. That's why he chose the higher quartile to compensate for them. It was put to him that he had no empirical or a quantitative analysis to establish this, and that's right. It seems like a fair assumption, but he could not prove it. Mr. Malachowski said he thought his adoption on the third quartile was conservative, as the relevant items here are in the brand among the most valuable in the world. So he said, this is worth something. In relation to figure 20, showing a brand range of 6.5 to 81.5%, it was put to Mr. Malachowski that the range was so large as to render it meaningless. He disagreed, and he said the range was reflective of the impact that a brand can have on business. But you can feel the judge is not happy with method 2. And he then also concludes, he says, in my view, there are significant difficulties in accepting the Malachowski method 2. The starting point is a purchase price allocation prepared by appraisers, such as external accountants for purchases of enterprises. And again, even if you know the purchase price, the allocation of that purchase price between tangibles and intangibles and different types of intangibles is still something done by accountants, maybe based on calculations of the company when they calculated their purchase price themselves, but it is still based on a number of assumptions. These are estimates, right? Those figures were prepared for other purposes, being acquisition, and were based on a number of assumptions that are not before the court and cannot be tested. So the judge throws out Malachowski method number 2. And then when we look at the judge's final conclusion, he says the determination of the royalty rate goes as follows. For the reasons above, I put to one side the right methods 1, 2, and 4, so he uses 3. I also put aside Malachowski methods 1, B, and Malachowski method 2. This leaves right method 3 and Malachowski method 1. As noted above, these methods are substantially the same. Both involve an assessment of an appropriate royalty rate based on identifying and considering comparable license agreements. So the judge is going for benchmarks, basically. And remember, the problem with the benchmark is you normally know very, very little about either of the parties on both sides of the benchmark transactions. Broadly, I prefer the analysis of Mr. Malachowski under method 1, part 1, to that of Mrs. Wright under her method 3. Mr. Malachowski has considerably more experience in relation to the valuation of intellectual property rights. And the court describes earlier in discussing these two expert witnesses that Mrs. Wright is more of a forensic investigator, but as we can see, her method is very thoroughly based in the arm's length method, whereas Mr. Malachowski was more of a dealer who's done many of these type of transactions before in his life. And then the judge says it follows from the above that subject to the matter discussed regarding the required exclusivity adjustment for one of the 4 non-exclusive comparables, I accept the figure of 5.88% provided by Mr. Malachowski under his method 1A, and this figure needs to be revised downwards in light of the exclusivity adjustment, because remember, one of the 4 royalty rates were doubled, and we now need to take a single value of that royalty. And this is where the court ends. So the deemed royalty rate was a little bit below 5.88%. I hope you enjoyed this video and looking at the different ways in which the different expert witnesses try to calculate this deemed royalty, because the contract already said there was no royalty, it was royalty free. And maybe you can use it in your practice at some point. I look forward to us discussing another case next time. Bye for now.